All right, friends. In true to form, forgot to record class 3 last week. So here we are at the end of class 4, which just happened, and I'm going back. I'm going to re-record class 3 for those catching up on YouTube. Canto, this is going to be Cantos 8 through 12. The class that was just today, class 4, was Cantos 13 through 17. But 8 through 12. To get you up to speed, if you've been staying up to date, we ended class 2 at the River Styx in Canto 8. Canto 8 was where we saw all the wrathful. And then we come to what's known as the gates of Dis. And the gates of Dis are important because they separate what I'll call the upper tiers of hell from sort of, I consider the gates of Dis like the inner portion of hell, or the inner gates. So the image that I hold in my mind, whether it's right or wrong, of the gates of Dis is something like the gates that Frodo and Sam and Smeagol see in Lord of the Rings when they watch sort of the army of Mordor marching out of this green castle and gates. That's how I envision sort of the gates of Dis, is this giant castle that Dante and Virgil come to after they cross the River Styx. And so this is in line 67 through 69. The good teacher advised me, "Now, my son, we draw near to the city they call Dis, with its great hosts and its grave citizens." So here they are. They arrive at this enormous castle that separates the upper tiers of hell. I say castle, but it's gates. The upper tiers of hell from sort of an inner sanctum that's something else. And so when they arrive, they see 1,000 fallen angels. They see 1,000 fallen angels that descend to sort of block their way from passing through the gates of Dis, and they're not really sure. Dante and Virgil, Dante specifically, he sort of sees this. He's taken aback. He's afraid, and so when the fallen angels see the not yet dead Dante approaching, they block the path, and Virgil has to talk to them separately to inform them that the journey has been ordained by above, and there's nothing they can do to stop it. So when they first see it, this is lines 103. When they first come to the gates of Dis and they see that they're blocked by these fallen angels, we have Dante say this. "And that Lord who had guided me so far said, 'Have no fear. No one can take us from our passage on, granted by one so great. Wait for me here and feed upon good hope to fortify your soul in its fatigue. I will not leave you in the lower world.' So saying, the sweet father goes his way, leaves me behind when I remain in doubt with a yes and no at combat in my head. I couldn't hear the words he put to them, but not long would they stand with him in place, when back inside the gates they scrambled, where our adversaries slammed them in the face of my good master, who remained outside and turned to me with slow and measured steps. His eyes were bowed to earth, his brow was shorn of all his boldness as he sighed and said, 'Who are these here to block my going down to the houses of pain? But you, to me, ignore my anger, no dismay, they'll bustle to fight it, but I'll have the victory.'" So what Virgil says is he went and, he talked to these fallen angels, and it's going to be taken care of. So to end Canto 8, he says, "On it are etched those words of death you saw. Already somebody's coming down the slope, passing through all of the rings without a guide, one who will breach these cities' gates for us." So what we learn is that when they come to these gates are locked. So right before what I just read, he says, they showed at once this insolence of theirs. So he's talking about the fallen angels. This insolence of theirs is nothing new. They showed it once at a less secret gate, which is, he's referring here to the gates of into hell itself that said abandon all hope, whose locks and bars stand broken even now. And then that's when he says, "On it are etched those words of death you saw. Already somebody's coming down the slope." So we learn that they come to the gates of Dis. It's locked. Somebody's coming, though, we learn at the end of this, to open it for them. So with that, we go into Canto 9. So in Canto 9, they're waiting at the gates of Dis. Dante and Virgil see the Furies, and they hear the Furies call to Medusa. Medusa says, they say, "Medusa, come, let's turn this one to stone," when they see Dante, who's not yet dead. Virgil shields Dante until that someone that was foreshadowed in the last canto arrives to open the gate. From there, they enter the sixth circle where the heretics are confined in tombs of fire. But before we get ahead of ourselves, so the Furies, just a little bit of context on the Furies. If you're familiar with Greek mythology, the Furies are sort of this order of female winged creatures and beasts that the gods of Olympus use to take vengeance on people who have killed members of their family. So in ancient Greece, killing a member of your family was the worst sin you could commit. So they used the Furies to exact vengeance. This is one of the main themes in some of the great Greek tragedies, where the Furies are sort of sicked on people who kill either their father or their mother. So that's the role that the Furies play. They're sort of the agents of the gods of Olympus of justice. But so after they come to the gates of Dis, they see these fallen angels, they see the Furies, they see Medusa. But Virgil has told Dante that somebody's on his way. And so they're waiting. And as they wait, there is an angel that comes down. That's who they were waiting for. So this is in lines, let's go 85. I saw he was a herald sent from heaven, turned to my teacher, but he made a sign that I should hold my peace and bow to him. How full of scorn did he appear to me. Came to the gate with a little wand, opened it. There was nothing to resist. I'm going to pause there. There's this idea here that this angel, the battle's already been won sort of in the Christianity view. Evil, death, hell has no power over sort of the force like the angel or even Dante. So there is this idea that kind of throughout the Inferno, there's a bunch of these creatures that Dante sees that scares him. None of them physically harm him. And so there's a case to be made that they can't physically harm him. And all that they can do at best is sort of bully him with thoughts of doubts and fears and uncertainty and get him to make decisions himself that would harm him. They can't, it's sort of like the idea of like a poltergeist or a ghost that we might have in modern day where they can't physically do anything to the person. That well, all they can do is scare that person into leaving or making a decision that they might later regret. But they don't actually hold any power. It's this idea that hell has no power. And so they comes down and he says, he taps the gate with a little wand. It opens immediately, nothing to resist. The angel says to the fallen demons, "Oh, you despicable race cast out from heaven, upon the horrible threshold he began. Whence do you fetch this pride that feeds on you? Why do you kick your heels against the will of him whose ends can never be cut short, who many a time has made your torments grow? What good is it to butt your heads at fate? Your Cerberus did so, if you may recall, and he still wears his chin and jowls skinned bull." So the angel comes down and he effectively is mocking these demons and he's saying, what are you even doing? You're still putting up a fight? Like, that you don't have any power. You've been told that Dante and Virgil are commanded on high. And then what happens is then he turned back on the filthy road without a word to us, as if someone with other business on his mind than what may press and sting the man before him. And so they made their way into that city. His holy words made them confident. So the angel uses his wand, opens the gates, and just turns and walks away as if it was nothing. And these demons can't do anything. They can't do anything. They're powerless. And so as they march to the gate, they march to the gates of the city of Dis. Now it's worth pausing for a second to just note there's a reason they go through a gate. There's something that marks a distinction between the souls they encountered before this point and the souls they will encounter after. And that distinction is everybody that they've encountered before it, whether it was lust or avarice, or gluttony, is the idea that they took some good. It was a good that they took too far. So lust, we got love. Gluttony, there is it's sort of like good food and good cheer are goods to be enjoyed until they are overconsumed. Avarice and prodigality, again, it's money is not the root of evil. It's the love of money that's the root of all evil. And so there's this taking something to an extreme, something that is not bad inherently, and using it in a bad way. It's using a good thing in a bad way. And then we have, wrathful. So the wrathful, you could view that as justice gone wrong. Wrathful are the ones who seek vengeance when they have been wronged. Now there's also sort of a important distinction that we'll get to with what's the difference between the wrathful and those who are violent to others, who is another circle we'll come to later. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we get to the next circle. But it's important here to remember that what comes after the city of Dis are people who did more than just use good things in a bad way. They sort of actively went against God, order, the nature of the universe. They did more than use a good thing in a bad way. So that is the distinction between the souls that are on sort of in the upper tiers of hell and the souls that we're going to encounter from here on out. So the first thing they come to after they pass through these angels and the demons and the gates of Dis is that they see the flaming graves of the heretics. So if we go to 118, here's how they're introduced. For flames were sown among those open graves and fired them to so great a temperature that iron forged red hot requires no more. All of their slabs hung open, and there came laments so bitter from within that they who made them seemed in misery indeed. So this is how we're introduced to the heretics that Dante is going to spend the next little bit having discussions with. So that's where we pick up Canto 10. So in Canto 10, we're in the sixth circle of the heretics. Dante and Virgil talk to the Epicurean heretic Farinata. And then they also talk to Cavalcante de Cavalcante, who's the father of one of Dante's friends, Guido. He's also a fellow poet. Cavalcante, so the father, prophesies Dante's exile from Florence and tells Dante of the limits of knowledge of the Inferno. So those are the few points we're going to talk about here in Canto 10. So first, what we learn when he encounters the Epicurean Farinata is they're in these open graves that are flaming, and Dante is sort of asked, he's like, who are these people lying in these graves? The lids have all been raised and no one seems to guard. So he's like, these graves aren't guarded. Why don't they just get up and leave? What's going on here? And so this is lines 10 through 16. These will be bolted on the day of doom, when from the valley of Jehoshaphat the souls bring back their bodies to the tomb. On this side in his cemetery lies that Epicurus with his followers, who put it that the spirit dies when the body dies. So what we learn here is that Dante puts the Epicureans here for the belief that there is no soul, that the soul dies when the body dies. And for that, sort of relying back on this idea of poetic justice, what he's doing is he's putting them in this open grave, because he's saying that they chose to bolt themselves into this grave by saying that there is no soul. And so they're perpetually in this grave. They're bolted on that day of doom into this open grave. So they can't move. They couldn't get out even if they wanted to. There are others, of course, that they meet along these tombs. But there is this idea of among the heretics, I guess, the idea that many of them sort of believe this idea that there is no soul. And so it raises this question of their situation. Why is that a heretic? So Dante could have gone a number of different ways. Usually when we think about heresy, it is something that is more akin to there are many ways that you would have thought that Dante would have chose maybe sort of some of the more, like Manichaeism, for instance. Some of the realms of philosophy and religion, perhaps, that were against or preached wrong things. Now you could say obviously the Epicureans, but Epicureans were more in ancient Greece than they were in Dante's day, for instance. And so Dante here sort of reaches back into ancient Greece to find some of the early, who he views as the heretics. But part of the reason he calls them heretics is because he views them as sort of going against the great God's sort of the greatest gift of God, which is the soul. And so the denial of one of these greatest gifts, the denial of the greatest gift from God in the denial of the soul, Dante sees as sort of a fundamental heresy. And I think that's why he goes back to ancient Greece to find the Epicureans as the first heretics that they encounter. Now, after Dante talks to Farinata, he goes and he talks to Cavalcante, so who is the father of Guido, who's a fellow poet in Florence, and he's a phenomenal poet. And then here Dante sort of learns that nothing of the upper world can be known by those in hell unless news is brought down to them. So this is in line 100 through 105. As a man with bad vision, Cavalcante replied, we dimly see things far away. So much splendor, the sovereign Lord still shines on us. When things draw near or happen, emptiness is all we see. Now, this is an interesting contrast biblically with 1 Corinthians 13:12, which has the famous line, "For now we see through a looking glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know even as I am fully known." So that's the opposite of what happens in the Inferno, as Cavalcanti tells us. In the Inferno, they see things dimly far away, and then as they draw near, emptiness is all they see. So they could see. Flip that with the Corinthians, where it's like dimly you see things far away, but then you see it face to face very clearly. So as it becomes more present, you see it more clearly, and that is inverted, as with all things of hell. If that's sort of the vision of paradise, is we see things in this earth dimly, what we will one day see in paradise clearly, face to face, then the inversion of that is that we can see them dimly now, but then from the viewpoint of hell, it's emptiness. So we won't see face to face what we now see dimly. That is the inversion that is happening here in the Inferno. It's one of the many inversions. So after that encounter, we leave Cavalcante, we leave the Epicureans, but we stay among the heretics in Circle 6, and we move into Canto 11. So in Canto 11, they see the tomb of Pope Anastasius, and the conditions of his heresy are a little vague. Some think he was sort of persuaded to teachings that Dante didn't necessarily agree with. So they have that he has a brief discussion with the Pope, and then before continuing on, Virgil describes the structure of lower hell and how the last three rings punish violence, fraud, and treachery, with the ring of violence split between those violent against neighbor, those violent against self, and those violent against God. Here also in this canto, we see a few different appeals to Aristotle. So this is where Dante reveals himself and his love for Aristotle. So as they're sort of making their way through these the lands of the heretics, Virgil is also giving some commentary about the structure of hell. And so he's telling us in line 64, so at the bottom of the universe where Satan sits, in the lowest ring of all, traitors are laid to waste eternally. Teacher, your explanation is quite clear, and you pieced out this chasm very well, said I, with all the people it confines. But tell me, those up there in the swamp slime, those wind-swept spirits, those the rain beats down, those tongues that jeer when they collide each time, why aren't they also in the city of rust to suffer if God holds them in this wrath? If he does not, how is their suffering just, and he to me? How is it that your mind goes madly wandering so far itself? So what Dante is asking Virgil here is, what's going on? Like, why are there different rings here? Like, why are those other souls? And this is where we get a summary of everybody he's met. The swamp slime, the wind-swept spirits, the rain that beats down, the tongues that jeer when they collide each time. This is a preview of all of the circles we've gone through previously. But then Virgil's given a whole structure, and he's saying, Satan's at the bottom. And then this is when he appeals to Aristotle's ethics. So in line 79, he says, don't you remember your philosopher in the ethics where he treats at length the three propensities that heaven does not will, incontinence and malice and deranged bestiality, and how incontinence offends God less and is taxed with lesser blame. So here we learn something of Dante's house, the structure of it. That as you get sort of lower, the idea is that the lower we get in the Inferno, in Dante's Inferno and in his cosmos, the more we are encountering things that offend God more. As so there's, if you could also view it as a journey into a descent towards the thing that offends God the most, as Dante sees it. And so as a structure very much informed by Aristotle. We get another sort of reference to Aristotle. This time it's to Aristotle's physics. And so the conversation starts on line 100. From intellect divine and from its art, and in your physics, if you gloss it well, physics referencing Aristotle again, and in your physics, if you gloss it well, you'll find not many pages from the start that your art strives to follow as it may nature. You are the pupil, she the teacher. So we might say that human industry is the grandchild of God. From these two things, remember the first part of Genesis. Man must derive his life in his advance. And since the usurer takes a different path, setting his hope in something else, he sins, despising nature and her follower. But now I'd like to move, so follow me, for the fish flash their tails on the horizon. The bowl is full northwest, and still ahead there lies our way to venture down slope. So this is where what Dante is asking, this is part of when Dante is asking Virgil in line 95, which I didn't read, but he asks him, when you said in usurer's usury, so the charging of interest, when you said usury is an offense against God's bounty, there's a riddle to untie. And so that's where Virgil, he's like, you should already know this. You've read Aristotle's physics, and you know that man must derive his life in his advance. Now, this is an interesting thing to think about in the context of our modern time, when interest is a very common thing for banks to charge or investors to charge. But what Dante and what Virgil is telling Dante here is that charging interest is something that lands people in hell, and it's a strange thing to think about, and it makes us wonder, what is it about interest that makes Dante place those that charge it in hell? All we really get is that man must derive his life in his advance, and the usurer takes a different path. I think what Dante is getting at here is this idea that man must derive his life in his advance. And I think during Dante's day, there was a tendency for the people charging interest. If you think about it that way, you could interpret them and their efforts and them charging interest in loaning money is deriving their advance off the effort of others versus deriving their advance off of their own effort. So there's somewhat of a violation of you reap what you sow happening here. So I think that's what's going on when Dante and Virgil are talking about why the usurers, the people charging interest, find themselves in the Inferno. It's because there's a violation of you reap what you sow, and that ancient law sort of happening in that relationship. There are obviously pretty strong cases to be made that insofar as interest compensates somebody for the risk of financing a venture, there's a strong argument to be made that is actually ultimately doing good in the things it incentivizes and promotes. But we're not going to solve that riddle today. As a venture capital lawyer, it's obviously something I see all the time. And you know, if the difference between somebody, the ability of somebody to get capital to start an idea that might change the world requires some incentive to get that capital in a way that is, you know, from a banker, from an investor, I think there's a decent argument, and that's, you know, interest is the protection for whoever's putting the money in. There's a decent case to be made that usury is not as bad as it's made out to be here by Dante, but I think what he's getting at is the more exploitative exploitive versions of usury that we see in things like dollar loan centers charging 20% interest. So after we they have this little aside about Aristotle's physics, then we move into Canto 12, which is where we're going to end today to try to get you caught up and then leave you in the hands of the next Zoom class. Hopefully this is the last solo one I have to record. But in Canto 12, this is where we come to the first of the ring of the violent. This is those violent to others. Now like I said, there's the difference between the violent to others and the wrathful are that the wrathful used a good thing in a bad way. So you could make the case that the wrathful were after justice and in a vigilante sort of way took it into their own hands, versus the violent to others. They're simply there's no eye for an eye happening in the violent to others. It's more of them just taking their rage out on other people. So when they reach the seventh circle, it's divided into 3 rings where the violent are punished. The first ring is guarded by the Minotaur, who's sort of this symbol of the bestiality of anger. And they make their way to the embankment where the centaurs, who are led by Chiron, shoot arrows at the tyrants and the murderers. So they shoot arrows at the violent. We're standing in a river of blood, of boiling blood, the Phlegathon. Dante and Virgil are then carried across the ford on the back of Nessus. So there are 2 important things to just touch on here. One is sort of the blind with rage, how rage or anger is associated with blindness, and then this idea of living by violence and dying by violence. The first one, blind with rage, sort of see that when they arrive in this circle, they find the Minotaur, and the beast, the Minotaur, if you're familiar with Greek mythology, is sort of the creature who is born because King Minos, also the judge of the Inferno, King Minos, when he becomes king, he asks Poseidon for a sign to show that he's basically selected as king. Poseidon sends him this glorious bull, but Poseidon sends him this bull and says, "I'm going to send you this so that people know that you have been selected king, but then you got to sacrifice it back to me." Minos doesn't do that. He loves the bull too much. And so as punishment, Poseidon sends the Cretan bull, and makes Minos' wife fall in love with the bull. They get together, and then the Minotaur, half human, half beast, is created as the symbol of shame and the symbol of disobeying the gods. And then Minos puts the Minotaur in a labyrinth, and then as part of Crete's punishment of Athens, every year, this is like the Hunger Games, every year Athens is forced to send tributes to Crete that then get fed to the Minotaur. Eventually Theseus will slay the Minotaur in sort of Greek mythology. That is who the Minotaur is. So the Minotaur is sort of this representation of sort of when man yields to his animalistic sort of natures and his vices, he lets his vices get the best of him. But Dante puts him as the symbol or the guardian of the circles of the violent. When they find him, basically the Minotaur tries to get in the way, and what Virgil says is, "Clear away, beast." This is line 19. "Clear away, beast, for this man has not come taught by your clever sister and her clue." So he's saying this is not Theseus, "but goes about to view your punishments. And as a bull who snaps his harness ropes when the death blows already set him reeling, he cannot charge. He but bucks this way and that. So did I see the furious Minotaur. Run to the gap," the wary poet cried. "Better go down while he is blind with rage." So Virgil basically the Minotaur makes the Minotaur throw a tantrum. He says, "No point in getting in our way. This has been ordained." And then the Minotaur throws a fit. And this is the snapped his harness ropes, and when he cannot charge, but he bucks this way and that. And he's blind. And so while he's blind, Virgil's like, "Hey, while he's distracted, let's go." So they slip past him, run the gap. But this is the future of everybody who has sort of violent tendencies, and it's sort of the blindness of anger. When we are angry there's also something going on here where it's saying, when we're angry at somebody, or when we are consumed with rage, there is a certain level of blindness that is occurring. We are angry because we are blind to something. We don't understand sort of what's happened to us. We don't understand why somebody has done something to us. And part of that is because we don't understand the context. We don't understand what happened in their lives to understand why they're doing what they're doing. We can't understand it. And so we get angry. That is oftentimes sort of a characteristic feature of our anger, and a precondition to our anger is a lack of understanding where they're coming from. So there's a certain blindness to it. After they escape past the Minotaur, they come to this scene that I mentioned where they see Chiron and the other centaurs firing arrows into the river of boiling blood and of murderers and tyrants. So the murderers and tyrants, they try to drag themselves out of the water of this blood, but the punishment, as with all sort of ranks, the punishment they gave in life, or the violence they delivered to others, is delivered to them in death. So what they gave is now given to them. So this is it. Let's go to line 73, where this is the description of the centaurs shooting the arrows. So they go by the thousands round the moat, the centaurs, shooting the souls who try to pluck themselves out of the blood more than their faults allot. So we approached those quick and sleek-limbed beasts. Chiron took out a dart, and with the fledge smoothed back the beard from both sides of his jaw. When he saw he had thus uncovered his large mouth, he said to his companions, "Have you marked how things move at the touch of him and back? The feet of the dead are not known for that. My good guide, beside his chest by now, where the two natures meld in company, replied, he is alive indeed, and I must show him the dark valley all alone, not for delight, but by necessity." So what he's saying here is Chiron says, "Who's this guy?" And talking about Dante. Dante's still alive. And Virgil tells him, I'm taking him on this trip by necessity. So Chiron then turns aside, and he's like, okay, he says, Nessus, go back. Nessus, this is in line 98. Nessus, go back, be their guide. If the troops get in their way, make them clear out. So Chiron taps Nessus, one of the other centaurs, and says, hey, help these guys need to make their way past these boiling souls in the river of the Phlegathon if they try to get in the way. So as they start to encounter these souls in the boiling waters, the question comes up of who they are, and the answer is, these are the tyrants, the huge centaur said, who thrust their hands for plunder and for blood. This is line 102 to 108. Here they wail for their ruthlessness and crime. Here is Alexander and fierce Dionysus, who grieved his Sicily so long a time. And it's not just Alexander and Dionysus, but there are others, Attila the Hun, Pyrrhus, Sextus. And so this whole river is full of people who in life are responsible for the deaths of many folks. So that is who they see as they're passing the river Phlegathon. And that brings us to the end of Canto 12. I'm going to leave off there for now. So if you are catching up or watching on YouTube, you'll be able to flip back into a Zoom class where we'll cover Cantos 13 through 17 and meet the remainder of those violent in the violent to self and those violent to God. Thank you for participating. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me or leave a comment on the YouTube video. And I look forward to continuing toward the end of our journey together. Peace.